They told me it was a mistake. The CTO fired me for a mistake, then walked out the same door wearing a new vest and a mandate. He thought that the manila folder, the HR scripts, and the upbeat slide about velocity were the whole play. He didn't know the patent had my name on it. He didn't know that the thing they called legacy garbage had my fingerprints, my late nights, my LLC on the bottom line. He didn't know he was evicting the landlord. If you're here because you like watching entitled tech bros get quietly dismantled, hit subscribe. It helps fund my tea fund and makes writing this slightly less moralistic and more caffeinated. My name is Emily. For 6 years, I was the invisible hand that kept Quantum Ops breathing. I was on their payroll in spirit and in coffee stains, but not on a W-2. I was a vendor, a licensor, and for the longest time I liked that. Autonomy, the ability to decide what I built and how it was used. Ironclad Logic LLC is 3 words and a filing fee, but it's also a legal structure with teeth. You give a company access to a product, and if the contract is written like a landlord-tenant agreement, you charge rent. They called it a license. I called it respect plus invoices. This isn't a story about some high school hacker revenge. It's about paperwork, labor, and the arrogance of new management. It's about a guy named Jared wearing a blazer that tried to teach servers how to be modern. He walked in like he'd been carrying a mandate since birth. Mid-30s, perfectly tailored obliviousness, the sort of smile that can present a new schema as if it was the answer to climate change. Jared had a haircut that suggested decisiveness, and a slide deck that suggested he had not read a single line of the systems he was berating. The first thing he said, before hello world, was that the stack was legacy garbage. He clapped his hands for effect, like he was applauding his own courage. They loved him. He offered metrics and a roadmap that mostly translated to rip it out. People who hadn't been on call at 2 a.m. and who had never had a warehouse manager call to ask why robots stopped knowing where the pallets were nodded eagerly. They called it modernization. He called it velocity. I called it dangerous. If there's a single human failing that wrecks more organizations than anything else, it's the belief that someone's fresh haircut automatically makes their opinions better than the collective institutional knowledge that kept things running. Jared had energy. He had confidence. He did not have context. He read the commit logs the way some people read horoscopes, looking for validation, ignoring inconvenient dates. To understand why his dismissal of legacy garbage mattered, you have to understand what Quantum Ops actually was.
On paper, it was a platform that coordinated fulfillment centers, orchestration, and the not attractive-seeming plumbing between a customer's checkout and a pallet leaving a dock. In reality, it was 6 years of slowly accrued compromises, elegant kludges, and a pile of interfacing code that someone, me, had assembled while swearing softly at 3 a.m. It was robust because it was messy. It was powerful because people had leaned on it and learned it. It had gone from a scrappy startup script to something enterprise-grade by way of a lot of survival engineering. Back in 2018, when Quantum Ops was 3 people and a dog named Kafka, I told them I would build the core scheduler, but as a product of Ironclad Logic. It simplified everything for me. I retained IP, they got a perpetual license contingent on their compliance and payments. They got to use the platform, I kept the keys to the kingdom. This was not unusual for boutique vendors. It was not edgy. It was business plain, well-documented, and, crucially, all spelled out in the contract we signed. There were clauses for payment cadence, clauses for scope creep, and clauses that said if they tried to fork or fundamentally alter usage or failed to pay, the license could be enforced. We negotiated the language. They asked for flexibility, and I added a clause that required notice before major architectural changes. They asked for uptime commitments. I asked for indemnities. They wanted to be able to change integration points. I demanded we agree on backward-compatible interfaces. It read like a stern cookbook. It was my best work between late-night debugging sessions and the kind of pride you only get from minutes that turn into outages avoided. I had learned long ago that if you don't write it down, someone will assume it's free. For years, the arrangement worked. I would ship a release, they'd install, we'd bill, and things stayed weirdly stable. I was the ghost in the machine. Present, not present, paid as a vendor. I didn't have a corporate title to list on LinkedIn, but I had a portfolio of engineered fixes and a phone full of "Hey Emily" texts at 2 a.m. when something unusual happened. The warehouse managers learned to say my name like a charm, not because I was a miracle worker, but because I knew the corners their dashboards tried to hide. Then Jared arrived. He wasn't malicious. He was simply confident enough to ignore the institutional memory that had kept a complex system humming. He wanted to ship new tech and unwire old assumptions like renovations in an Airbnb. He wanted to cut corners until the corners disappeared and call it efficiency. He wanted to centralize, to standardize, to replace. To him, legacy was a synonym for opportunity to show pivot potential. To me, legacy meant lifetimes of fixes, customer workarounds, and places where time had forced us to be inventive.
The restructuring announcement, that's the word they used in the email, capital R and everything, arrived on a Friday. They booked the glass conference room that looks out over the loading docks, which is the sort of place executives go to make decisions feel cinematic. Jared stood at the head of the room, feet perfectly placed near the edge of a slide that said, "Scale, simplify, accelerate." People clapped because clapping is how humans sign formal consent to change. He called the workforce over-indexed on low-velocity artifacts, which is management speak for, "We're going to fire people who actually keep the stuff running." They handed me a calendar invite with the terse title, Meeting HR. It had the kind of time that suggests something definitive. I have always treated my calendar like a ledger. If someone sends you an invite that says HR, and you have a legal relationship that is vendor-based, you check the contract, because sometimes the paper you think you've signed is the only thing between you and nonsense. On one side of the glass, Jared was charismatic. On the other side, Richard, the CEO, looked like someone who liked to believe optimistic projections more than the people who had to get the numbers to line up. He smiled as if the slide deck was doing the heavy lifting. Brenda from HR carried the manila folder with the offer packet and the NDA that reads like a velvet glove around a resignation letter. Mike, a junior dev who had been there less time than he'd had coffee, sat stiff and looked like he wanted to be both nowhere and somewhere useful at the same time. They practiced the script. It was efficient. It used the words restructure, position elimination, and severance package in the same breath. The room smelled of new printer toner and someone who had had a frustration-free morning. Jared took the opportunity to explain that the platform had to be modernized and that the company was moving towards a new architecture. He said legacy garbage out loud as if it were a diagnosis and not an insult. When they pushed the manila folder across the table, there was an almost cinematic pause. I looked at Richard's watch the way you look at a timeline. This was a moment moving along cause and effect. They slid the packet to me and said, with the practiced warmth of people who had rehearsed empathy, that this was a difficult but necessary change. They thanked me for my years of service. They used the word transition in a way that felt like someone arming a phrase to blunt its meaning. "There's a clause in my contract," I said, and my voice made the room decide whether it was going to be surprised or bored. They were surprised. "We're offering competitive severance," Brenda said, as if money could stitch humility back into the speaker's collar. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I have a different clause in my paperwork." I opened the manila folder. There is something delightful about opening a paper folder in a room full of people who assume everything is digital and therefore easy to dismiss, and produced a PDF, printed and highlighted. They had no reason to expect this. No one had ever brought legally highlighted documents into that particular meeting. Highlighted lines read like anchor from a very measured person. "You're a vendor," Jared said rudely, as if he'd just discovered a new tax bracket. "We offered you a seat at the table. You refused being on payroll." "I never refused a seat," I replied. "I chose a different table." It was explained. "The license agreement hasn't been breached from my perspective, but there are payment and usage conditions. If you want to discuss this as a business matter, we can. If you want to hand me an NDA and a severance offer because you prefer the optics of a clean break, fine." Mike's eyes flicked between me and the packet in my hand. There was that human moment where you suspect someone else knows the plot twist before you do. I could see Jared's smile falter for 2 heartbeats, like a well-edited film. They tried the classic close. Sign the NDA, take the package, walk away. It was a comforting script for mid-management people. It reduced nuance into a tidy exit. But the nuance we had carved together for years was the thing they were trying to walk off with while pretending they were doing them a favor. The contract, which they had long treated as a paperweight, was a living thing in my hands. It was a ledger and a leash, and now that they were trying to evict me, a bargaining chip. "You're not firing me," I said. That line lands differently depending on your tone. I said it with the sort of weary clarity that comes from someone who has been wronged methodically, not with a tear, not with a shout, but with the kind of voice that implies both litigation and an invoice. Richard blinked. "What do you mean? We asked you to step aside." "You asked me to step aside," I said. "I retained intellectual property. I licensed it to you. If you want to terminate usage rights or alter them, there's a process we agreed upon. If you want to discuss an IP transfer, I'm willing to listen. But a packet and an NDA is not a negotiation. It's theater." Jared crowded the table like someone trying to turn a conversation into a takeover. "You're being dramatic," he said. "We can just reassign responsibilities. We'll containerize the services, replace the monolith with microservices. We'll have people make it cloud native. This whole thing will be a week of firefighting followed by a month of regret," I finished. "I've seen it happen." They were prepared, physically, with the packet and the courtesy of HR.
but emotionally, they were not prepared to have a vendor look them in the eye and ask for market rate valuation instead of a quick goodbye.
The difference between being a dismissed employee and being a licensor is the difference between the emotional moment of getting sacked and the cold arithmetic of somebody who actually read the terms. They tried to flatten the situation with management speak. "This is about organizational alignment," Jared said. "We're aligning talent to strategy." "I help align freight to dock doors," I said. "That's a different sentence." The meeting closed with the usual niceties. They asked me to sign the NDA for everyone's protection. I declined because an NDA that operates as a gag post-termination needs consideration. I declined because I could have been quiet and taken a severance, and months later watched funds flow out of the company and into a vendor who didn't have the craftsmanship to answer support tickets. I declined because I thought some people ought to be allowed to feel small in a glass room for a few hours. They escorted me out. Not in a literal police out way, but in that corporate manner where someone calls security to walk you to the elevator, as if the building itself needs a narrative closure. They did it with smiles and a business card for an outplacement firm. Mike watched through the glass as if this were an event in another country. I left with my laptop, my manila folder, and enough dignity to be annoying about it later. People in startups think that indignity is a fuel like any other. The truth is that it's heavy and precise. I got into my car, which is to say I put on a playlist and fumed politely. The rest of the city moved as it always does. The warehouse across the street hummed. Someone in operations texted Mike to check a queue. Life somehow still had its usual capacity for banal progress. I drove to my apartment, which is a place where a lot of engineers do their dramatic thinking. Lots of plants, a lamp over a desk that has seen better prototype nights, and a framed manila folder ironically mounted as a joke about office life. I poured a glass of something that belonged in a cheaper bar than my current tastes justify, and sat at my kitchen table with the contract open. When you've been a vendor, you tend to sleep with your clauses under your pillow. Contracts for me are like maps. They don't hand you treasure, but they tell you where the boundaries are. The language was precise, as it had always been. There was a clause about payment cadence, a clause about permitted modifications, a clause about the license's conditions, and a clause that spoke to enforcement in the event of breach. It was not vindictive language, it was tidy. And because it was tidy, it gave me options that a severance letter wouldn't. It didn't give me power to do illegality, it gave me contractual leverage. The grayness of modern corporate life is that power often resides in the footnotes.
I called my lawyer Heavy Metal Dave. Yes, that is his actual nickname, and he collects vintage band tees, because I prefer my legal counsel to be both competent and memorable. He laughed exactly once on the phone at my story, which is his way of accepting both the absurdity and the taste of inevitability in corporate hubris. "Send it to me," he said. "Don't do anything until we talk. If the company wants to be cute about this, we'll be less cute." I like Heavy Metal Dave because he speaks legalese with a throatiness that makes you want to hire a drummer. He also draws attention to the fact that you should always have someone who can reduce paperwork to a series of viable steps. We agreed to consult, to read the clauses, and then to decide on a precise and legal course of action. He said words like enforcement and remedies without the joy a novelist might take in them. The weekend was quiet and cruel in the way that weekends are when you are waiting for a corporate ripple to either happen or not happen. On Saturday, I brewed coffee. On Sunday, I walked the dog, passed the warehouse, and saw a forklift driver wave a hand at a loading bay with the same carelessness he gives to bad radio stations. Every business ecosystem contains small shocks and little kindnesses. You calibrate them together like a machine. I should say here, bluntly, that I did not go home and hack anything. There is a difference between lawfully enforcing contract terms and doing something illicit, and I have never been interested in being anything but lawful. The drama of the internet loves myths about the lone genius with terminal access bringing down empires by night. My story is less glamorous. It's a story about clauses, invoices, and the unpleasant arithmetic of entitlement. Still, when a company tries to paper over a contractual relationship with a severance NDA and a smiling HR rep, you can either let them walk off with your work and call it a humiliation, or you can treat it as what it is, a negotiation disguised as an exit. I chose the latter. Monday arrived with the kind of punctuality you get in business. Jared walked into the office with the same purposeful stride and a plan to reorganize the way the company outsourced its brains.
Mike texted me early, an emoji that suggested worry. He said in a message that looked like it was typed with hands that had seen too many all-nighters, "Are you okay? Everyone's talking about the meeting. Jared's already sent 3 emails. I did what you do when you are a vendor and a human being of some practical bent. I checked my inbox, called my counsel, and tried not to make anything dramatic of a legal process that could become messy if handled poorly." Heavy Metal Dave advised against headlines. "We move slow and precise," he said. "Except when fast is required, then we move letter of law fast." There was a period of what one might call corporate discomfort. Jared strutted a little more loudly. He rearranged some meetings.
He forwarded a lot of docs with a kind of optimism that comes from not understanding your own dependence on a service. He liked to talk about pilot teams, as if pilots were voluntary rather than infrastructure. Then, because nothing in enterprise systems ever respects your sense of timing, a vendor alert started pinging in operations. Not a hack, not a malicious act, just automated alerts the way systems use to tell humans that something upstream is unhappy. The alert was a symptom, not a diagnosis. Warehouse processing latencies ticked up. Customer-facing dashboards started showing the kind of reds that make managers breathe into paper bags. Jared, who had been busy projecting confidence, changed his stride into what we call panic sprint. He called Richard. He called Brenda. He rang the on-call rotation. People who had crowed about velocity were now asking for the thing that fosters velocity in the first place: expertise, context, and someone who knows where the wires are. They called me. Mike texted, "They want you on a call. Jared is on the line." I stared at the phone. I had choices. You can take the call and act like a benevolent consultant, fixing the immediate problem, patching the system, and letting the company proceed to behave in whatever arrogant way it likes. You can sign a non-disclosure and a severance, and let the folks who called you legacy garbage have the comfort of their clean narratives. Or you can do what people who actually own the contract sometimes do. You can point out that the terms they are violating, public procurement of services, modification without notice, missed payments, have consequences. The consequences are not mystical. They are contractual. They read like options a rational actor would choose only if they couldn't be bothered to honor the deal. I did not pick up the phone immediately. I let it ring. Let Jared sweat. Let the CEO convulse into calendaring another all-hands. Let them taste a sliver of the thing they had been dishing out for months. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about letting entitlement experience what it feels like to be inconvenienced by paper. "Emily," Mike said on the line when I finally answered, voice thin. "We can't get the fulfillment queue to move. The payments gateway is timing out on reconciliation. People are calling." "What's the error?" I asked, because that's what you say when you try to remain a professional in the middle of an emotional script. "The heartbeat check is failing on some of the vendor integrations," Mike said. "It's flaky. Jared wants it containerized." "Is the license server responding?" I asked, because the license server was the one part of the stack that talks about permissions and allowed behavior in a way an engineer can trust. There was a hesitation. "It's intermittent," Mike said. "We're seeing 503s. You can imagine the rest of that morning like a black and white film where men in vests run in place and the camera cuts to red error messages. I sat with my coffee and my contract and mentally ticked the clauses. There's a delicious kind of clarity that comes from having contingency language written down. There's also a certain professional satisfaction in watching people who are used to using you without reading you suddenly peruse the document like it's their salvation. I didn't act flagrantly. I didn't do anything dramatic, at least not yet. I took notes. I called Heavy Metal Dave. I asked him to prepare a draft letter that would outline potential remedies. I told him I was not ready to make noise in public, but I wasn't going to be quiet either. That is the center of the story. Quiet legal leverage is far more unsatisfactory to entitled executives than the noisy variety. In the glass conference room where the manila folder used to sit, Jared now moved like someone poorly reconciled with the idea that you can build your way out of every problem. He sent an email to the Eng All list asking for status. He CC'd Richard. He typed things like, "We need to spin up redundancy." He did not, to my knowledge, read Clause 12.3. I have always admired the ritual of corporate panic for how honest it becomes. When people are desperate, they stop pretending about values. They start calling lawyers.
They start looking through contracts they once used as placemats. They realize that ownership is not just an abstract concept reserved for legal teams. It's a ledger line that shows up on balance sheets and in bank accounts. And so the scene set itself. A new CTO with a mandate he mistook for omnipotence, a CEO who wanted the optics of progress, a junior staffer watching the old hands and the new team clash, and a vendor who had the contractual right to speak. Monday bled into Tuesday with escalations and more alerts. Jared grew louder and more certain in public, while privately making more frantic calls to people who could articulate what had been built over the past 6 years. I started receiving calls from legal. Sharon, an outside counsel with a voice like wet steel, told me to document everything. She asked for copies of emails and highlighted clauses. She was efficient and, as far as lawyers go, emotionally sensible. I like Sharon because she will tell you if something is legally interesting, and it's also likely to cause headlines, which frequently make the corporate office uncomfortable in a uniquely marketable way. At some point during Tuesday afternoon, the company performed what I'd politely call a procedural lob. They drafted an internal request for IP transfer and circulated it with an urgency that suggested they had realized they were improvising and needed to formalize improvisation into a contract before someone noticed the improvisation would cost them market share.
It read like desperation dressed up in legalese and placed on a window seat. They thought they could buy their way out of the issue with speed and the right framing. That, too, is a common corporate fantasy, that money can be waived in a way that retracts the past. Money can buy access. It can't necessarily restore trust, but it can buy quiet. I sat at my table and watched the emails unfold. Jared's tone shifted from, "We're innovating," to, "How fast can we get an IP transfer?" He misread how contracts function. He treated the legal document as a menu you could pick from if you could afford the dish. That is the central comedic tragedy of modern tech leadership. They confuse the act of buying with the act of having built. The narrative crescendos into a choice landscape. You have the option to be conciliatory and accept a severance, to be magnanimous and let a thing go, or to exercise the clause that keeps your property whole until the licensee honors its obligations. Each choice has consequences. Each choice says something about how you honor your work. I told Heavy Metal Dave to prepare an outline for potential negotiations. I asked Sharon to be ready to draft an invoice for any transfer. I sat. I checked the heartbeat of the company in the way one checks a pulse, through emails, through frantic calendar invites, through the Slack threads where people who actually keep the lights on muttered darkly about the next 6 months. I did not revel in their discomfort. I cataloged it. By Wednesday morning, Jared had called a meeting with finance. There was language now about transferring stewardship and pathing to a perpetual license. It read like a plan assembled under pressure. They were starting to factor in the cost of replacing tribal knowledge with acquisition. They were looking at the math and not liking the result. This is where the story in some versions becomes about pure vindication. In other versions, it's about regret. In my version, it's about recognition. Companies forget that systems are not only code. They're human knowledge packaged into invocations and ad hoc routines. When you attempt to excise that knowledge by calling it legacy, and you refuse to pay for the pieces that hold it together, the risk is not just an outage, it's the moral hazard of telling people their labor is disposable. I didn't want a scene where the company had to grovel for help. I wanted them to understand that contractual relationships are binding, and that mistake is an odd euphemism for active misreading of an agreement followed by hubris. I didn't want to humiliate anyone beyond what their decisions deserved. I wanted to be paid what my work was worth, and I wanted the record to show that a woman who'd been dismissed as legacy had in fact held important rights. If you are waiting for some neat moment of theatricality, where I smash a keyboard like an indie film, you'll be disappointed. Real corporate chess is quieter. You flip rules. You move ink, you invoice, you wait. And so, at the end of a week that started with a man in a vest calling my life's work legacy garbage, the calendar read negotiations pending. The legal team for Quantum Ops Inc. had finally begun to ask the right questions. Jared had sent a curt message asking for options. The CEO had woken to the sound of people asking what the company's uptime meant if the people who knew it best were being dismissed. Mike had texted me a photo of an empty desk that used to belong to an engineer they had let go 2 months prior, with a caption that simply read, "We saw this coming." I closed my laptop on Friday night with ink on my fingers and the contract on the table. The house smelled faintly of something coffee-ish and old papers.
There was a small bottle of Old Crow in the back of the cabinet because every story needs a little human nonsense to be believable. I poured myself a measure and sat in the lamp's light. I could have handled it in several ways. I could have gone back, signed the NDA, taken the money, called it a loss, and worked on something new. That is a respectable life plan. I could have burned bridges in a way trumpets of doom would appreciate. That is a less practical route. Instead, I chose something else. To prepare to enforce the contract if necessary, to let the legal process marshal the facts, and to be ready to demand fair market value if they wanted to own what they had not bothered to value before. On Sunday night, as the city slept and the warehouse hummed like an animal that had learned to ignore certain noises to survive, I found myself in a strange place. I had been dismissed under the pretense of a mistake, an error in judgment from a man who thought newness trumped knowledge, but the reality was far cleaner. When you build something, you should get to define its terms. I had defined mine. They had signed. I set an alarm for Monday with the absurdity of someone who plans to be calm for a fight. I told Heavy Metal Dave that, pending his review, I was prepared to exercise the remedies spelled out in the contract. Do it clean, he said. Do it lawful. Do it loud enough for them to feel it and quiet enough for you to keep your reputation. He chuckled in that way lawyers do when they know you're about to turn a moral victory into a financial transaction. The last image I remember before sleep was ridiculous and ordinary. The framed manila folder on my wall, a memento from years of corporate absurdities, suddenly looking less like a joke and more like a ledger. I thought of Mike, of the warehouse, of the people who actually move goods for customers, and of Jared, who had worked in thinking he could unplug a human network with a slide deck. They had called my removal a mistake. I had other plans for the paperwork. And then morning came, and the phone started to ring. And then morning came, and the phone started to ring. The first call was Mike.
He said it like someone calling a relative from an airport. Short, a little ashamed, urgent. Emily, it's bad. The fulfillment queue is stalled. Refunds are queuing. Operations is getting calls. There was a background noise of a meeting in session, voices I half recognized, the rustle of someone shoving a stack of printouts into a folder. Are you on call? I asked. We paged someone, he said. Jared's on 3 threats. Richard's on a call with finance. They want options. That was corporate talk for, they want someone who can explain why the things they paid for still matter. I took a breath, because that's what people do when they're about to do something that feels businesslike rather than theatrical. I opened my messages, and there was the expected flurry. A lawyer from their side asking for a conference line, Sharon pinging with an evidence request, and a calendar invite titled with touching optimism, Emergency Ops Response. When you're the vendor who actually knows what lives inside an integration, you show up. There is a moral choreography to the decision, being the helper who stabilizes things at cost, or being the holder of the keys that, when used within contract, can make a point loud enough to be heard on the other side of a conference table. This was not a morality play. This was a calculation. I thought it over in the lamplit hours that weekend. I thought of the severance packet sliding across the glass like a bandage. I called Heavy Metal Dave and put him on speaker. He loves being read into dramatic scenes. His voice on the line always makes emails feel like potential tour dates. Do nothing rash, he said, cheerfully, but be prepared to enforce. If they want to do a transfer, make them pay for the privilege of cleaning up their own mistakes. Make it loud enough for them to feel it, I said, quiet enough to keep our relationship with customers intact. He laughed. I will draft the correspondence. Sharon can coordinate the exchange. No theatrics. I told Mike to compile logs, but not to do anything invasive. Document the errors, I said. Get the timelines. Sharon will want everything buttoned up. I phrased it like a checklist, because professionalism is a kind of palliative in the face of panic. By late morning, Jared's public composure had cracked. In internal threads, he was suddenly less visionary and much more reactive. He started calling for outside consultants. He typed urgent in the subject lines of emails with the kind of fervor that suggests trying to summon competence by repetition. Richard, who had promised that modernization would be painless, was on an endless loop between finance and legal. Brenda from HR sent a somber message about team well-being, and then promptly scheduled a series of listening sessions.
Sharon called, and in that voice lawyers have when they're trying to calibrate between formality and threat, said, "We need to confirm, have there been any payments missed that would constitute a material breach of the license terms?" I told her the invoices that were overdue. I told her the change orders that had been implemented without the required notice. I told her, without melodrama, that the language allowed for enforcement if usage diverged from the agreement and if payment obligations weren't being met.
Sounds like we'll have leverage, she said. Prepare to issue the draft for transfer. We'll set your price. Keep all communications through counsel. No unilateral steps that could be perceived as malicious or disruptive. Which is to say, do it by the book and make them pay attention. I liked Sharon because she is prefatory. She gives you the feeling of a scalpel without the theater of a chainsaw. By the time Jared realized that the problem was not a clever bug but a contractual one, the office had moved into a kind of frantic choreography I know well. People who had been confident now making contingency plans. Someone called in the integrator. Someone else blamed a load balancer like a man blaming a colander for his cooking. The Slack GIFs grew more desperate. They proposed options. Can we buy a perpetual license? One email asked. Is there an emergency escrow? Another inquired. These were all attempts to turn ownership into a shopping list. They were trying to convert a relationship into a line item, because in their minds, ownership had the same texture as budget approval, something that could be stamped and forgotten. Sharon sent me a draft letter, an offer to discuss transfer of intellectual property for a figure she suggested should be market-based. Heavy Metal Dave looked it over and put little notes in the margins like a stage director fussing with a script. He wrote, "Start high. Let them talk themselves down. No public statements. Payment via wire before transfer. We retain explicit language about usage and warranties." I scribbled a number on the back of an envelope, the sort of number that in the past would have gotten me an expensive dinner and a nod from someone in a suit. $2.6 million. It felt sensible. It felt larger than the severance packet they'd slid across the table on Friday. It felt like the difference between being pitied and being remunerated. They escalated fast. The finance team produced a spreadsheet, and the procurement folks who had been willing to save money on vendor management in the past suddenly discovered an enthusiasm for speed. Jared wanted a motion to proceed that included minimal interruption. That phrase is popular among people who have not experienced interruption. It is quaint like a bumper sticker. We opened negotiations in legal formality. Sharon sent a letter outlining the company's breaches and the remedies available under the license.
Heavy Metal Dave sent an invoice for a preliminary transfer fee to secure negotiations, and when their legal team called, they spoke not with the swagger of Friday, but with the coolness of people trying to contain a situation. They asked for proof of the invoices and a timeline. I sent the documents. I sent the highlights of the contract. I did not gloat. That felt unnecessary. The press of it, watching a man who'd called my life's work legacy garbage suddenly call for meetings to procure the product he'd belittled, was delicious in an unsentimental way. It was not about revenge. It was about compensation. It was about a ledger balancing its books. There was a particular delight in sending an invoice instead of a resignation. The universe rewards sensible accounting. Meanwhile, the outage continued to widen. Warehouse scanners lost reconciliation for a few hours. Orders were delayed. Customer service began triage protocols. Jared's answers were slower. His "we're transitioning" line sounded like a prayer rather than a plan. He called me twice in one afternoon, once to ask if I might look at the logs, and once to plead about reputational damage. I let the calls go to voicemail. There is a very human advantage to letting someone find their humanity in a voicemail box. By Wednesday, there was an actual meeting between our counsels. Sharon and Heavy Metal Dave placed their phones on the conference table like chess pieces. They spoke in a register that translated to "you breach, you pay," without the theatrics. Their words were legal and dry as toast, but they had the effect of a quiet guillotine. It is surprising how differently people respond to the same conversation when it's couched in clause numbers rather than emotion. Quantum Ops' legal team proposed a buyout number that was not remotely acceptable. It was the kind of opening offer people make when they assume they'll still be getting the advantage on value. Heavy Metal Dave quoted a counteroffer that made the CFO momentarily ill. They bickered over escrow, warranties, and a transition plan. I watched the negotiation like you'd watch a well-run auction, where everyone knows the item's provenance and the bids are parts of a dance where the sooner you bow out, the more you forgo. At some point during this negotiation, Jared asked me to join a call and talk through the cleanup. He framed it as collaboration. I framed it as them implicitly accepting the need for continuity. I had no interest in being the company's unpaid stability training service. That is a role that the entitled often request when they have suddenly discovered a problem they failed to fund. I declined politely. I'll consult through counsel. There was a private moment when Sharon leaned across the table and turned her voice into a practical tool. If they wire funds, you will instruct their counsel to escrow the transfer documentation. We will confirm receipt, file the assignment, and coordinate the technical handover with a defined scope. No unilateral changes until funds clear. Fine, I said. And if they don't pay? Then we don't transfer, she said. You can restore access if it aligns with your business judgment, or you can hold as leverage, legally. We proceed in a way that maintains reputational clarity. It is a relief dealing with people who talk like that. They make the moral and the legal converge. They make it clear that being a grown-up in tech means sometimes taking steps that look mercantile rather than dramatic. That clarity is its own kind of victory. By Thursday, the urgency had calcified into a plan. Finance made room for a wire. Procurement drafted a statement for the board about preserving customer experience and preventing long-term destruction. Jared, who had started the week with swagger, now spoke of accelerating the transfer. He'd learned a word enough times to believe it would save him. They wired money. It arrived in a way that felt exquisitely businesslike, not a triumphant fanfare, but an electronic thud. Sharon called to confirm receipt. Heavy Metal Dave slid into an implacable role of someone who knows how to accept currency and then retire like a person who has done their job. Contracts were signed. Assignments were executed. We wrote the transfer letter like two people transferring custody of a complicated instrument. Careful, thorough, and with a note about future support that was compensated and time-limited. They asked if I would re-enable the system immediately. I agreed to a coordinated handover. There was a clause about transitional support for 30 days built into the payment. I framed the call with a list of deliverables, documentation, a knowledge transfer schedule, and invoices for any additional remediation work beyond that scope. When I executed the handover, I did it as a professional. I did not thump chests. I did not celebrate in the meeting. I logged in, verified the sequence they'd requested, and then disabled the enforcement mode that had been applied, lawfully, by contract terms. The heartbeat checks returned green like someone flipping the lights back on in a theater after an intermission. Alarms ebbed. The warehouse console stopped reporting exceptions. Jared exhaled in a way that sounded like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. There was a peculiar moment of silence as the system settled. I imagined it as a room where air finally stopped being electric. Mike texted a gif of a small victory dance. For about 5 minutes, Jared's emails contained the word thanks in a way that looked almost like remorse. I filed all the emails into a folder labeled transaction and did what professionals do after a large event. I made myself tea and checked my calendar. Over the following weeks, there was a cleanup phase. We executed the transfer. The $2.6 million wire landed and cleared. I signed the assignment paperwork. The intellectual property that had been under license was now under new ownership. No longer a line item in my ledger, but a completed transaction. I met with Stan, someone from Apex I'd been loosely in contact with for a while. He'd watched the events unfold not with schadenfreude, but with a recruiter's interest. Apex, a competitor that specialized in a different vertical, had been following my work for years and had been affectionate about the kind of craftsmanship I brought to messy systems. Stan offered me a seat at a table I had once avoided, a title, a team, and a contract that finally valued the liability and the labor. He wanted me to lead a new product that respected the rituals of operational knowledge and paired them with engineering rigor. He didn't use words like legacy garbage. He used words like institutional knowledge, product-grade scale, and respectful modernization. I accepted. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about being in a place that acknowledged the worth of what I'd built. My offer included equity, a reasonable salary, control over the team composition, and an explicit clause about IP contributions. I negotiated it like a person who had watched two sides of the same coin, craft and commerce, and decided to fold them together. A month later, I walked into Apex for the first time, wearing a blazer that fit and carrying a notebook I'd bought the week before when the pandemic inventory sales were still a humorous conversation item. Stan introduced me to the team, engineers who'd been tupes in the trenches, product folks who still prioritized real metrics over vanity dashboards, and a director who had a talent for steering bureaucracies into productive corners. Tyler, a young product evangelist with a nervous laugh and an enthusiasm I'd once had, asked if I'd mentor a new hire. I said yes. There was, for a while, a press dust-up. Business reporters ran the story in the same tone they'd run any tale in which corporate hubris meets a clause. CTO missteps cost company millions, read one headline, which is both accurate and also incomplete. It focused on the person who courted spectacle rather than on the structural lesson. The world of software is a world of relationships and contracts. Treat the labor and the ledger with equal respect. That part of the story could have been the ending. Move to a new role, a new office, a glossy photo, and a Twitter thread. But there are subtler aftershocks worth noting. First, the people who had been dismissed as legacy were suddenly less dismissible.
The engineer who'd been let go 2 months prior got a call from a smaller company that needed the exact knowledge he'd been dismissed for. He emailed me a month after everything settled and told me quietly that his inbox had filled with offers. He had, he said, a new job and a renewed sense of dignity. That was a merciful byproduct.
Second, Jared did not, as the tabloids might prefer, become an exemplar of villainy. He moved on in ways that suited men with new vests. He left, found another role that appreciated his ability to convince people of future states, and wrote a Medium post about the challenges of leading in rapid growth environments. He used the words learning opportunity. That is what the modern economy offers ambitious people, a series of learning opportunities from which they often profit. Third, the company learned something tangible about dependence and valuation. They restructured their vendor management, repopulated their operational documents, and, to their credit, started paying more attention to the service-level commitments they'd once footnoted. They updated procurement rules. That kind of institutional learning can feel like a small victory, but it matters. For me, the transaction had a practical sweetness. I had, in the course of a week, converted resentment into ledger lines. I had reaffirmed a principle: owning the keys to your work matters. It wasn't about turning an outage into theater. It was about using the language of commerce to enforce respect. I'll take the quiet procedural wins over pyrotechnics every time. There are 2 meta lessons I keep telling people who ask. First, read your paperwork. Contracts are not romance novels. They're maps. They make boundaries legible. They allow you to operate with clarity. If you build something, you can negotiate terms that preserve your leverage. That's not being literal about law. It's being literal about your own agency. Second, don't let theater replace currency. People who prefer the optics of a clean resignation often think they have the moral high ground. They don't. They have optics. Optics fade. Bank transfers do not. There was an emotional subtext to all of this that was for me the strangest part, the way gender and ageism weave into conversations about legacy. When Jared called something legacy garbage, he was using a shorthand that did more than dismiss code. He dismissed the people who had been in the rooms at 2 in the morning and who had answered calls on a holiday. There is an economy to that erasure. It cheapens experience and pretends newness equals superiority. I turned that erasure into negotiation. That is a lesson worth repeating. You can be quiet about being undervalued, or you can convert the injustice into a business proposition. I prefer the latter. The sale of the IP freed me to build without being entangled in the politics of a company that hadn't valued the labor that made it function. Apex was, from a practical standpoint, a dream: resources, respect, and a mandate that included letting engineers actually solve problems for the long term. The team I assembled included some of the people I'd worked with at QuantumOps, people who were tired of being asked to do miracles for free, and who wanted finally to write sustainable code. We built a different system. Not a monument to stasis, but a practical, thoughtful platform that accepted the reality of messy integrations and honored the human knowledge baked into them. We put processes in place to capture tribal knowledge, compensated people for documentation, and created onboarding that treated context as a first-class product. There is beauty in that, in turning the things that once caused friction into structures that reduce the need for heroic firefighting. People ask whether I regret the escalation. Did I wish the company had worked things out differently? Sometimes, in quiet moments, I imagine a world where someone like Jared reads a room and chooses humility. But that's wishful thinking. The truth sits somewhere more prosaic. Systems need people, and people need protection. Contracts are a way to provide that protection. I also don't like to pretend that every conflict resolves neatly. The optics of my story make for a tidy narrative. License revoked, system stable, wire arrives. But the real thing was more granular. Monthly invoices, service credits, people anxious about the future. The months after the sale involved onboarding, documentation, and a lot of human work nobody writes press releases about. That is the part I loved, the ongoing, patient labor of building something reliable. One small vanity detail I keep: I framed the original manila folder and hung it above my desk at Apex. It reads like a joke, paper in a world of microservices, but it is a reminder of what happens when relationships and terms are left unread. I keep the old Crow bottle in a drawer as a tiny relic of nights spent thinking about code and commerce. Heavy Metal Dave still sends me memos when references to song lyrics when a negotiation goes especially well. Mike sends updates about how his new team is going. He's moved into a role that finally pays him for being exceptional. People still ask for the villain-laden version of the story. They want the closet drama, the classical villainy. I give them this instead: a ledger, a contract, an invoice, a lawyer who knows when to make noise and when to be quiet. It is less cinematic, more efficient, and it left all the customers, those faceless end users who merely want boxes to arrive on time, unharmed for the most part. That matters.
There are ethical edges to the tale. I never wanted to weaponize outages for personal pleasure. I wanted, and I achieved, a legal resolution that recognized value. That is the difference between vigilante mythology and professional practice. I enforced the contract because the contract existed, and because the company had chosen a course that put them at risk. It was not a perfect experience for anyone involved. It was, however, honest business. A month after everything settled, I was at a small industry dinner. Someone at the table said casually, "So you're the one who made them pay," and everyone pretended to laugh. I didn't correct the narrative for them.
I told the story honestly. Contracts are maps. Don't sign things without lights on. The table listened. An older engineer nodded and said, "Good. Make them pay. We've been doing work for free since the internet was new." That, in a way, is a tiny triumph. When people who have been underpaid for expertise see a fair quantification of their labor, you get a quiet ripple. I like those ripples. The title of this piece is accurate. CTO fired me for a mistake. I owned the patent. The quotation marks around mistake are important. In corporate lexicon, mistake is often a euphemism for a decision we prefer to reframe as an error because it lets us avoid accountability. Owning the patent didn't make the CTO's decision wrong in his own head. It made the company's options different. They could have negotiated. They could have honored their obligations. Instead, they chose the script of dismissal. I chose the script of business. If there's a final practical note, it's this: guard your work and don't confuse being liked with being valued. If you build something, make sure you understand what gives you leverage. Sometimes leverage is technical. Sometimes it's contractual. Sometimes it's both. Mostly, it's the willingness to make a clear, adult business decision rather than opting for moral grandstanding. For people who ask what they do in similar circumstances, I say the same thing Heavy Metal Dave told me. Prepare, document, use counsel, and keep the process lawful. That last point matters because it keeps your reputation intact and your moral authority intact. The world rewards people who do the dull, correct things. I'll close with something I tell the team at Apex when they get anxious about a new hire or a new architecture. The work is never finished. You are not a hero for surviving an outage. You are a craftsman. Craftsmen get paid. Craftsmen keep records. Craftsmen make good work repeatable. If you liked watching a dude in a vest get a comeuppance administered through a bank transfer instead of a movie fight scene, well, this is the modern equivalent. It's quieter, and it costs less in pyrotechnics. It also pays better. If you want a follow-up, tell me which you'd prefer. A prequel diving into the 2020 logistics nightmare that birthed quantum ops, high-level, no sensitive details, or a pragmatic, non-actionable narrative about how I trained and organized the Apex team to avoid legacy traps in the first place. Comment below and subscribe if you want more stories about entitled leadership getting politely outplayed at the negotiating table.